Marcus Freeman and Notre Dame are looking for a new defensive coordinator, and one name has emerged as a potential candidate to be co-DC along with current defensive backs coach Mike Mickens. Would Freeman be taking a big risk with this hire, and what could the ramifications be? We cover that and a whole lot more on today's Locked On Irish.
You are Locked On Irish, your daily podcast on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to episode number 400 with me, Tyler Wojciak, as the host of Locked On Irish, and I'm thrilled to have you here on Tuesday, January 28th, and thanks for making this your first listen of the day. While you're here, remember to subscribe on YouTube or Apple, Spotify, or wherever else you're listening to the podcast. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. All right, it's only been a week, but this offseason has already been loaded with news, and to cover all of that, we got Locked On's very own recruiting insider Brian Smith on the show today. We cover a potential new candidate to be Notre Dame's defensive coordinator. Pete Sampson of The Athletic reported that Chris Ash is a target, and he is expected to be the co-DC along with Mike Mickens. Now, none of this is official at the time of this recording, but there are a lot of ramifications of this move if this is the route that Notre Dame elects to go, so we're going to cover that. Plus, we go in depth on the loss of Chad Bowden. I did an emergency show last Friday night when that news broke, but we talked about why Bowden would elect to make this move, where Notre Dame could go to replace him, and then we end the show with some thoughts on Junior Day. Notre Dame hosted nearly 20 prospects this past weekend. Big recruiting weekend, tons of news coming out of it, so let's get to it. All right, Brian Smith is back with me here, and even though the offseason for Notre Dame is 1 week old, we already have a ton of news to talk about, so let's dive right into it. Marcus Freeman is in the midst of hiring a new defensive coordinator to replace Al Golden, who is now with the Cincinnati Bengals, and most people expected Mike Mickens would get a promotion from defensive backs coach to become the full-time DC, but now it looks like Marcus wants Mickens to be co-DC with a new hire, former Rutgers head coach Chris Ash. Pete Sampson of The Athletic was first to report the news, and even though it's not official, a lot of people have strong opinions about this potential hire. So what is your perspective on the situation?
Well, it's multifaceted. Number one, he's coached at Ohio State, so I assume that Marcus knows him on a personal level. His defensive style, I think, kind of fits. He wants to be aggressive. And I also think that him being a guy that's been around some other people that Freeman trusts probably tells me there's a good chance he could work in some capacity. With all of that being stated, Notre Dame fans are now spoiled with thinking they're automatically going to have a national top 5 defense. Note to fans, that is false. I don't even know if that would have happened if they'd have kept the same staff. It's really hard to do, but Al Golden, I'm guessing, probably wanted to leave as much as anything else, like a lot of other older coaches. They're not dealing with the NIL and recruiting. That's going to be the answer until I die for like why a lot of guys go to the NFL. It's pretty simple. But Ash is a guy that has coached at Texas, Ohio State, Rutgers. He's been around. He's been a decent recruiter. Urban likes him, but I mean, I've seen stats on like his track record, defensive efficiency. It's been all over the place. So I have questions too. My biggest question, though, is one we can't answer till the fall. How does he blend with the staff? And being the outside guy, getting the job may or may not work. And that's one we simply will not know until next fall.
Right. I think that's an interesting aspect of all of this is when you have a co-defensive coordinator, like he's not bringing in really any members of his team. He's kind of walking into a situation that's already been in place, and they've had a ton of success, not just with Mike Mickens, but Max Bulla, the linebackers coach, Al Washington on the defensive line. So it's interesting bringing in an outsider, but if he is a co-defensive coordinator, he'd be working alongside Mike Mickens, who was the defensive backs coach this past season, was the cornerbacks coach prior to that, and Ash also has a ton of experience coaching defensive backs. My assumption would be that Mickens would handle the corners and co-DC, and then Ash would be safeties coach and co-DC as well. So what do you think about that partnership? Because they're going to have to be working together a lot between Mike Mickens and Chris Ash.
Well, that's the thing. Like Mickens obviously is a tremendous DB coach. I don't think anybody in their right mind, no matter how much you like or dislike Notre Dame, can dispute that. How much does he need to be the DC right now in totality? If, in my opinion, I have no interest in trying to figure this out, even if I had the access, but I'm guessing he's not overwhelmed with it or else he would leave. We've heard that he's going to be co-DC, etc. I'm guessing it's going to be fine, but they've had to have had conversations that we're not privy to. I don't think Freeman's an idiot by any stretch after what he's done in the last year. Like, that program has changed so much, and hats off to him. I'm sure in some capacity he's had Mickens and Ash speaking together and thinking, okay, what can we do in these situations? How would we attack this team, et cetera? USC, Ohio State, Michigan, playoff game, whatever. I think it'll work pretty good. But you got to remember, Freeman is a DC by trade as well. So you have a third head in the room to try to figure out, especially teams that have similar talent to Notre Dame. So I don't think it'll be that big a deal.
You already mentioned the fact that he worked with Urban Meyer, was actually the co-DC when Ohio State won the national championship under Meyer back in 2014, and then spent some time with him with the Jacksonville Jaguars. And Ash was actually most recently not on the sidelines. He was a pro scout for the Jags this past season. I know a lot of fans saw that and they're like, wait, this guy wasn't even a full-time staff member last year. But when you work under Urban Meyer, on one hand, Urban's a great coach, but he was a hard ass. Like, let's just be honest with his coaching and his recruiting philosophy. So how do you think Ash will fit into the culture, but also, the coaching philosophy aspect at Notre Dame and what Marcus Freeman wants to run?
The personality is the biggest concern from what I've heard, because he was a guy that would get after people in a more of an old school way. I know that, I read something Tim Priester wrote today. He's like, that will not work at Notre Dame. That is an absolute unequivocal non-starter in today's Notre Dame. And Tim is right. If he doesn't do that right, it'll be one and done. There's a certain offense coordinator that was at Notre Dame about 5 years ago that's why he left. He was basically asked to leave because he's just the way he treated people. That being stated, based on what I've been told and just a little bit of knowing about him, you got to remember now he's in the NFL, so his capacity with the playbook has expanded, and that's the incredibly advantageous situation he's in, being in the pro level. He's going to bring a playbook back, probably not a whole lot different than what Golden had. I had questions about Al when he went to Notre Dame because, his age, NFL guys sometimes overwhelm college kids. Maybe there's something there, but everything that I've heard is he wants to be aggressive. Notre Dame blitzed, I think, top 5 ratio in the country off the top of my head. That's going to be similar. So I don't think he would disrupt the scheme. So forget the personality for a second. I think that would work pretty well. And that's the most important thing for Notre Dame. Continuity. You're good. Don't screw it up.
The continuity aspect is a big reason why most people expected Mickens to get the job, right? Because they wouldn't have to change up the scheme that much, the terminology, any of that. But now you bring in Ash, who has an NFL background, and he'd have to work alongside Mike Mickens. And I think you just have to look at it like this. And I'm just asking for your opinion here because there's really no way to quantify it at this point in time. Marcus understands that if he brings in an outsider, it might rub Mickens the wrong way. He might be inclined to leave. But there's also a risk in promoting a first-time DC, even if you're trying to maintain the success that you've already had just with a different defensive coordinator. So do you think it's riskier to promote Mickens and be the full-time DC or run the risk of letting him walk because he didn't get the full-time job and you bring in this outsider to help him out?
That is a wonderful question, one that I don't know if myself or anybody else outside of Marcus Freeman knows. The only thing I can think of, and obviously not having experience, it'd be kind of hard for Marcus to throw that in his face because he didn't have any head coaching experience. So there's some similarities there. But at the same time, I'm guessing that Mickens is a guy that will play ball with his staff. And eventually, Mickens is going to be a college football head coach, barring something maybe he goes pro route. But he's not going to be at Notre Dame a whole lot longer. Either way is how I see it. Prove me wrong on that, but I would say 2 more years, absolutely top. So I don't look at it as big a deal. First, I know a lot of Notre Dame fans are throwing things at the screen right now. That's not how it works in today's world. Like Tom Osborne's staff, Bobby Bell, the staffs like that, 70s, 80s, those days just don't really exist. The money changes so much and the opportunities that he'll probably leave sooner than later, but I don't know if I would lean one direction or the other because I'm not real crazy about guys without experience being Notre Dame's DC, but Lord have mercy. Some of the kids we've seen, think about the youth, Leonard Moore in particular. Did you see a better corner this year than Leonard Moore as a freshman? I sure didn't. I mean, I knew he was pretty good in high school. I didn't know he was that good. So part of it was he got coached up And he figured out the playbook because Notre Dame's defense playbook was not friendly for upperclassmen, let alone a freshman. So they figured stuff out. And they also have a guy that has been in this system long enough. So I wouldn't have been shocked if they gave it to him. But that's a hard call, man. The only other thing I could think of is like Ash just has similar ideas to them, and it's just somebody that would be easy to assimilate. So maybe I lean outside in that capacity, but I don't know. That's a really great question.
I've said it before too, with especially after the emergence of Leonard Moore. Like, if Mike Mickens offers a high school prospect, then I am convinced that is one of the best corners in the country, and he has earned that distinction by his efforts with Benjamin Morrison, Christian Gray, and now Leonard Moore. So at this point, when you look at the staff as a whole, where would you put Mickens in terms of like the most important assistants left on the staff?
Except for Denbrock, he's number one. Notre Dame's inability to attract wide receivers is one of the other topics that, unfortunately, you and I, and you probably more times than you would like to discuss, have mentioned on this channel. Without an elite, and I truly mean elite, passing game coordinator like Denbrock, you're not going to get those kids at Notre Dame. I know a lot of the top receivers, the way they think, wanting up front, NIL, et cetera, it's just not a very good fit for Notre Dame. So you got to have something to help there. So I'd put him 1, but 1A, I would put Mickens, because historically, throughout my lifetime, Notre Dame couldn't sign a corner to save their life. Even in the Lou Holtz era, they sucked at signing corners. They signed a ton of running backs and moved guys to DB. That's what they did. So, I mean, both those guys are worth their weight in gold. Yes, pun intended with Notre Dame there. But it's just one of those things where you can't have one of that. You got to have both. Those guys are so valuable to Notre Dame in terms of talent acquisition. And to your point, well said, Tyler, the evaluation process. Here's the funny thing. How many Texas fans are angry right now? Moore lived just outside of Austin, if I remember correctly. Oops, Texas didn't make a hard run at him. And from what I heard, neither did the Aggies. Yet he's a freshman All-American at Notre Dame, started in the national title game. And he was the guy they didn't throw at as a true freshman. He still has to play, unless some rule changes, he has to play 2 more years of college football before he's even eligible to turn pro. So Notre Dame needs something like that to happen on offense at receiver to it. Certainly maybe not to Leonard Moore as well. That's ridiculous, but still, that's the only thing left. Like, this staff has been really, really good. So a lot of options there.
We'll be right back with Brian to hear his thoughts on Chad Bowden's decision to leave Notre Dame for USC and the potential impacts of that move. But first, a message from our friends at FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. 1 game, 2 teams, endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's the icing on the cake. I've got to dive into the props here, but I always love betting on all kinds of weird stuff for the Super Bowl, including the coin toss, and my favorite is the length of the national anthem. And you can download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. Notre Dame also has to hire a new general manager after Chad Bowden left to take a similar position at USC, but with a much bigger paycheck. And this move caught a lot of people by surprise. But what was most surprising to me is that it didn't seem like Notre Dame put up too much of a fight to keep him. Last year, they went through a similar situation when Bowden was being pursued by Michigan, and Notre Dame fought like hell to keep him, and that's exactly what they did. Now, they did give him a competitive offer after USC gave him basically the world in their initial offering, but what did you make of this move and the way things transpired?
I think there's 2 parts to this. Number one, I think Notre Dame was wasting its time making a super highly competitive offer, because USC wasn't going to be outbid. They're tired of getting beat by Notre Dame. That's what this was about. This was more about taking from Notre Dame than adding to USC. If they had to go to $2 million, they probably would have done, which Notre Dame would go into. They're not going to beat Notre Dame as long as Notre Dame's recruiting like this. So they've got insane amount of money tied up in Lincoln Riley. They really don't want to fire him. But if they don't do something this next season or whatever, they need to at least show, hey, we've got a top 10 recruiting class. That's why they were throwing that money. As for Notre Dame, it's easier to replace a guy. I mean, he did a great job. I'm not saying anything wrong with Chad. He did an incredible job. But it's easier to get a guy like him now because Notre Dame, due to Chad and several other people within the organization, have risen the expectation and the roster. The next guy has an easier job doing the same thing, but I'm sure it will be easier to get a lot of different people, maybe even an NFL guy, to come in and do something like that. Because if I'm not mistaken, Chad was doing a lot more of the NIL contract and that stuff. That's got to be, that would be so far out of what I would want to do. I would rather stick with the recruiting stuff. I don't know. They just made Chad do it. I don't know. But you can probably hire a lot of different people that have a financial background and coaching. It's easier now. So I'm more curious about the back office staff with recruiting than anything else because that's still the bread and butter.
Yeah, that's kind of how I looked at it. Chad absolutely was instrumental in building this roster to what it is now and being able to compete for a national championship. Like, I don't want to make it seem like I'm dismissing the work that he did, but I also think it's important to point out that the job he has done the last year, really ever since Michigan was pursuing him and they promoted him to that general manager role, is not what he was doing before. Like, yes, he's still involved in high school recruiting, but his first job when Marcus hired him was to mostly handle like high school recruiting for the defense. And then he was like the recruiting coordinator for the entire team. That's not his full-time job anymore. So I wonder if Notre Dame looked at the situation like, look, this is a great opportunity for Chad to go elsewhere, but now they can hire someone to replace him at a position that maybe, you know, all the aspects of it weren't necessarily his strength. So now that Notre Dame has to hire a replacement, what do you think they're going to be looking for in this role? Are they going to be looking for another Chad type or maybe, you know, someone from the NFL because so much of it has to do with contracts, NIL, and recruiting and evaluations?
It could be split into two roles. There's so many ways that you could really reform this. I really think you know this, but not when in college. Once here, you basically need like two guys doing NIL, one that's in office every day, and you need somebody like talking to people on the road, like talking to everything that goes on. It's a lot for one person. I'm not going to get into specifics of the coach, but there's a big time coach in the SEC that made note that one of the biggest things they do is put out fires. And I'm like, what do you mean? And they said it's dealing with the people that come into the office, like current roster. The third uncle comes in with that is a disaster. I would not do well with that. I would probably get fired for a lot of reasons in those conversations, but that's something you got to have. You got to have different personalities for different situations. Chad's a fiery guy and somebody that's a go-getter. You may need somebody that's more businesslike in certain circumstances and rotate them. And you still probably need somebody that's a younger personality, that's a go-getter like Chad for recruiting, that they're probably always going to get plucked going to the NFL. It's because they make more money. You always have to have somebody on deck there as well. Like this area is swelling. You need to have two or three people that are in Chad's realm to have a chance to compete with Georgia, Texas, USC every year. Because whenever those schools have a quarterback, it's really hard. You're not going to compete with them in the trenches year in, year out. So you got to find those gems. And that's what Chad was great at. He helped find those kids. And then he moved to NIL and he did pretty good there too. And Notre Dame's NIL really improved. So I would not be surprised if they did multiple people in those roles.
Where do you think the loss of Chad Bowden will be felt the most?
With the kids they already built relationships with for the 26 class. There'll be kids that he goes after for USC. And I know people don't like this either. Players pick coaches, administrators, not schools. And you can throw things all you want. That's never going to change. There will be somebody they lose because he's not there or somebody else on the staff. Maybe I know there's one recruit that told me that they really liked a certain defense coordinator that's now in Cincinnati. He told me that like 2-3 days before the move happened to go to the Bengals. And I get it. Al Golden made a decision for him and his family, and that's fine. Players pick coaches, etc. The only other thing I can say is, again, Chad helped them with a lot of these kids that were fringe players early on, like Mikey Gilbert. When I first watched his film, I'm like, he can be a number 3 receiver at Notre Dame. And then 6 months later, I watched part of his film during his senior year, and I'm like, this guy can be a Notre Dame number 1. Like he's improved dramatically. He can foresee things happening, and that's a really rare skill. I don't know if I've ever seen anybody better at that than Urban, but Chad was really good at it. So finding somebody that's good at projecting, especially kids that have more of the Wake Forest Vanderbilt offer instead of the Georgia Alabama offer, is something Notre Dame always needs on its staff.
Brian has some big updates coming out of Notre Dame's Junior Day event, but first a word from TurboTax. Taxes was dealing with piles of paperwork and frustrating forms, and then waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back. Now Taxes is easily uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who is matched to your unique tax situation, an expert who's backed by the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress, and you get the most money back guaranteed, all while you go about your day. No stressing, no worrying, no waiting. Now, this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. And right after Bowden left, Notre Dame hosted nearly 20 prospects for its big Junior Day event this past Saturday. And despite the loss, it seems like the staff made sure everything went smoothly, and the reports coming out of that weekend seem to be very positive. So what have you heard about how Junior Day went for Notre Dame?
Everything is basically what you would expect. Every outlet that I've read something on or anybody that I've spoken with, it was really well organized. Marcus Freeman's great with the recruit. Like, it was a broken record, and which is a good thing for Notre Dame fans. There are a handful of kids that may or may not commit. They got a few more kids to learn about the school. Will probably take OVs. If I was to guess, and you and I went over under, the number's probably around 20 or so that they had at the event. I would bet at least 10 kids that are not already committed to Notre Dame sign with the Irish from this group. They do such a good job in it. That part, again, is Chad was part of this, of finding kids that are not only really good football players, but you went to school there, Tom. It's not normal to go to Notre Dame and do the academic load and the social part of it that most the kids that I deal with at 7-on-7s and Under Armour camps and all that, most of those kids don't want to do that. Notre Dame finds those kids really, really early, builds a bond, and gets them. I would wager they sign at least 10 of the kids that aren't currently committed from that list. That would be my over-under, because everything I've heard went really well. I haven't heard one kid that it went really bad. And usually, no matter what, there's at least one. I didn't hear anything like that.
Yeah, and that was the first time that Notre Dame could really put on a showcase for recruits since this magical run in the college football playoffs. So they had already made some significant headway with all the prospects who were already on campus, right? They had been recruiting them. They go on this run. So obviously they're in great position there. But looking from a more, national perspective, like you said, you talk to a lot of kids all the time. Notre Dame is not even on their radar. Well, after a run like this, after Notre Dame makes it to the national championship, they beat a team like Georgia, they beat Penn State. Ultimately, they come up short in the national championship. But how does a run like that impact Notre Dame recruiting under Marcus Freeman?
Massive. I live down south, and I was just at Battle Miami, and that's the most important 7-on tournament of the year, bar none. Kids from LA to Miami, from Houston to New York, and Notre Dame was talked about more during that tournament than at any point of any tournament I've ever been around, and that was right before they played the game. So that's not surprising. But at the same time, there was just a lot of respect for how they were being recruited. I asked a few kids, okay, well, Notre Dame's in the game. That's, you're going to watch it. Well, what about it? And just depending on the kid, which person it was, but there was a coach or coaches on the staff that had made a dent in their recruitment. So that really matters. Faison was there, his little brother. He's a stud. There's kids like that. And Davis, the linebacker, he was really high on Notre Dame. And they discussed how Notre Dame had made a difference in how they recruited him. Sincere Johnson, kid from Ohio. His second offer was Notre Dame. Freeman's been involved with him forever. The consistency with recruiting and then adding the winning on top of it, that's your cherry on top. You're probably going to get one or two more kids if you play your cards right than you normally would. This is, I call it the Bobby Bowden effect. When Florida State finally got over the hump and started getting into the top 5 in the polls, all of a sudden they just had a top 3 class every year. Literally for 15 years, they had a top 3. It was gross. I'm not saying Notre Dame because academic standards are different, et cetera, but you should have a bad class number 8 moving forward if you do your due diligence. And based on how Freeman recruits, I'd be kind of surprised by that.
Yeah, it seems like after a run like that, they absolutely have to capitalize. But last question on the way out here. Now that all the focus is on the class of 2026, who are the prospects that you and I are going to be talking about for the next 11 to 12 months?
I mean, there's a bunch of guys. The kid that I'm personally interested in, he was at junior day, is Braden Robinson. I knew him when he was coming out of 8th grade, which is gross within its own self. But he was a kid that was like the fastest kid in the country for his grade. And he didn't get a lot taller, but even when he was 3-4 years younger than everybody, he ran by guys that were power 4, 3-4 years ago. Notre Dame does not get that kind of kid. They need to find a way to get him. Connor Solomon, another kid that was actually on the visit, he ran 10-4 before. If you can get those kind of receivers with the way Notre Dame recruits offensive line, tight end, and running back, then you change how defenses have to play you. That really good running back's not seeing that extra safety in the box, etc. So that's probably in any great receiver is the first thing. And then the defensive line. Notre Dame has made a lot of effort. I don't want to just pick one guy per se, but I'm going to butcher the name, Ebenezer Iwa today, that like the defensive end. He's a really athletic kid that's raw from North Carolina. That's another kid that they found before some other schools went after him. I would bet based on his frame and what he's done, Notre Dame will be trying to battle off somebody like North Carolina, Tennessee, or Georgia at the end, but they need to find a way to get a few more pass rushers too. So everything they've done, I would just say, look at the receiver position, D-line. Those are the two spots where they needed a little bit more in that national title game against Ohio State to any of those kids.
Brian, thanks as always for the time. I really appreciate it. And for being on all the postcast shows throughout the playoffs. I know I really enjoyed my time in a couple of those, and I've heard great feedback from them. So always look forward to the chance to catch up. We'll do this again soon, man. Take care.
Thank you very much.
All right, that's going to do it for this episode. Thanks again for tuning in to episode number 400 of Locked On Irish. I cannot believe that I have done 400 episodes, but when you're talking about this team every single day, I guess the number of episodes racks up. By the time you're listening to this, I'm going to be in Charlotte for a work trip at my other job. So I'm going to try to get an episode out on Wednesday. It's going to be pretty tough, admittedly, while we still kind of wait to hear where Notre Dame goes with this defensive coordinator. And I'm going to be busy this entire time I'm out there in Charlotte. So once I'm back, which is Wednesday afternoon, I'm definitely going to have an episode up on Thursday and Friday of this week. So make sure you stay tuned. You can follow me on social media. The X account is @LockedOnIrish. Instagram is @LockedOnIrishPod. Or the best way to stay up to date with every new episode is to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you're listening to the podcast. And if you enjoyed the show today, remember, give this video a like if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're listening to the podcast, rate the show 5 stars and leave a review. Have a great day, everybody. I'll see you soon.